Welcome to the May 11th, 2009 work session. Work sessions are a more informal setting to update the council on business items. No votes will be taken on any of these work session items. We will add an executive session to discuss personnel. There will be a short break after the first item. Public comment is allowed that is germane to an agenda item. If you wish to speak, you are required to fill out a public comment card and turn it in to the city clerk's staff. Public comment will be allowed for a total of 10 minutes per agenda item and no more than 2 minutes per person. Public comment will be heard at the beginning of each item. Once the item is called, no other public comment cards will be accepted. Please silence all cell phones. Will the city clerk please sound the agenda item?
First item is traffic calming update. Mr. Carter Lucas.
Here. This is an update of our traffic calming program, a little bit of history on traffic calming, and where we expect to go with the program overall. And Shannon Fain from Street Smarts is here tonight to kind of give us an overview of that program.
Thank you very much. I need this. Okay. As Carter mentioned, give you a quick overview of a history of traffic calming, what we've done for the city of Milton, and where we're at now. Okay. Traffic calming, the goal of traffic calming is to reduce vehicular speeds on roadways where speed is not the primary design consideration for that roadway, residential streets for the most part. It originally began in Australia and Europe, particularly in Denmark and the Netherlands, and started here in the U.S. back in the mid-'70s, Berkeley, Charlotte, Gainesville, a couple other cities. And at least here in the U.S., most programs didn't start as a full-fledged program. It started where one neighborhood did it, another neighborhood noticed that, liked it, said they wanted it for their neighborhood, and it spread that way, and then you had a citywide program. Originally, a lot of early programs dealt with road closures, just physically shutting off the road to keep cut-through traffic. But nowadays, most programs go on speed control, humps, bumps, lumps, speed tables, other devices. Another development that's just started here in the last decade or so is what a lot of people call natural traffic calming. And this is simply where you build in design standards for your subdivisions from the beginning, which try to cut down on speeding. So it's not going back after the fact and adding in something, but it's designing the actual subdivision to discourage speeding. You do that through narrow streets, on-street parking, having trees lining the streets, which 20 years ago would be viewed as dangerous, as something you could run off the road and hit. But now a lot of them viewed as positive because it makes you slow down a little bit. Here's a quick breakdown of a typical traffic calming program. Somebody requests the traffic calming. They're speeding on my street. Could you look at it, address that? Then you have a roadway type requirement where the city or the county would look at the road and says, is this a type of road that would qualify for traffic calming? And that's usually a local road. You wouldn't have traffic calming on interstate, collector, arterial. Then there's usually a volume requirement, the vehicles per day. If it's too low, it's not cost effective. If there's too high a volumes, you're no longer a local road. And then there's usually speed requirement. You don't usually have traffic calming for places with posted speed limits above 30. Because once again, you're no longer a local road at that point. Okay. Now I'm going to go through some different types of traffic calming. Most people know the speed bump and the lump, but there's lots of other types. Speed bump is one of the older, more common ones, just the standard speed bump. Or a speed hump is elongated. You don't have quite as sharp as a rise, and it's spread out over a longer distance. A speed table, you have a rise, then a flat portion, and then a drop. So it's basically a more elongated speed hump with a level portion up at the top. Related to that, you have raised crosswalks, raised intersections, which are basically a speed table where this whole part here is flat, and then each approach has to come up, and usually that flat part is brick or some type of paving structure. One that's really popular in the last couple of years are speed lumps. And they're kind of like speed humps, but you have these level sections in between it, which your vehicle's wide enough, you can straddle the raised part and continue on at full speed. So emergency vehicles, fire trucks, stuff like that, could continue across the lump without having to reduce speed, but your normal passenger car would hit one of those. The axles aren't, or wheelbase isn't wide enough. And sort of related to that is a split speed hump. And that's where you have a hump on this side of the road and not on that side. And I'm not sure how well you can see that, but down there you have the opposite, where it's on that side and not on the right side. And what would happen would be an emergency vehicle would be able to come in, swerve over to here, swerve back, and not have to reduce speed as much as if they were driving over the actual hump. But personal vehicles wouldn't be allowed to do that. One that's up for debate are roundabouts. They've gotten to be more and more popular in the U.S., but people debate whether or not that's an actual traffic calming device or just an intersection treatment. And the big thing with roundabouts is instead of coming straight through the intersection, you have this little diversion around, and that little diversion deflection slows you down a bit. So that's where the people that claim that it's traffic calming say that that little diversion is enough to slow it down. And also, pedestrians crossing can use these islands as refuge points. Okay. Those are all examples of vertical deflection, which are easier to put in. They're putting in a hump, lump, bump. Horizontal deflections are ones that causes the car to swerve or have to avoid the object, so thus you'd slow down. Examples of that would be a chicane, where instead of just a straight road, you have this outcropping here, there, and there, so it makes you kind of swerve in between them, slows you down. Other examples, you have a good overhead view here of a choker. That's where your road narrows at a point, slowing you down. But horizontal deflection devices are a lot more expensive to put in after the fact. You're putting in, you're changing the pavement, you're putting in planters, different devices, where the vertical you can pretty much put down anywhere. Okay, where are we at now? The City of Milton's Department of Public Works approached Street Smarts and asked us to help them update their traffic calming program and policy. And the task they gave us was to review the existing ordinance, study similar programs throughout Georgia and the country, use the knowledge we get from those to develop a new program for Milton, and then go back and look at all the backlog of requests that came in before a program was in place. And here's what we ended up coming up with. We used a variety of sources in Georgia, Atlanta, Gwinnett County, Woodstock, all the way out to Utah, Minnesota, Ohio. We used Institute of Transportation Engineering guidelines, FHA guidelines, variety of sources. And as with most programs, the request would come from an HOA, neighborhood group, or it could come from an individual citizen. And the requirements we came up with for Milton was the road had to be a local residential street. Posted speed limit had to be 25 or 30 miles per hour, and it has to meet all of these requirements. Sorry. The daily volume must be between 400 and 4,000 vehicles per day. And the 85th percentile speed must be in excess of 3 miles per hour over the speed limit. Okay. And the timeline, I'm not sure if y'all can read that, it's a little small. This is a general breakdown of how the process would occur. First step is that somebody would approach the city and say, I would like you to look at traffic calming in this subdivision, this neighborhood, this street. The City of Milton verifies that the roadway meets the eligibility requirements and collects a $155 fee from the requester. And that fee is it's a negotiated rate for 2009 to do traffic counts to see if it meets the volume requirements and the speed requirements. Next step is where that study is carried out. So the City of Milton determines if that problem actually exists. If it does, if it doesn't, they notify the requester that it doesn't meet the requirements. If it does meet the requirements, the city creates a concept design and a cost estimate and presents that to the HOA or the individual or the neighborhood group. It is then up to that person or that organization to go out and collect 75% of the people in the neighborhood's signature to support the installation of the traffic device and to pay their portion of it. And that portion we came up with was the HOA would pay 50% and the city would pay 50%. So the neighborhood, 75% of the neighborhood would have to agree to pay 50% of the cost, with the city paying the other 50%. In the current program, it's a 75-25% split, with the city paying 75%, and now we have it at 50%. And then once that's collected, you actually have the construction installation. And then 6 months later, and this cost is covered up here, 6 months later you have a post-construction review to see if it's helped any, see if it's lowered speeds on the street. Okay, once we had that in place, we were able to apply that to the backlog that we had. Our backlog was made up of 18 requests over 11 subdivisions. So some divisions had more than one road or section of road that was requested. And once again, it had to be a local street, 25 or 30 mile per hour speed limit, daily volume between 400 and 4,000, and the 85th percentile speed had to be 3 miles per hour or higher over the speed limit. There are the 11 neighborhoods that we had requests for. You see about 3-4 of them had more than one location. And we had 19 total locations if you count the 11 subdivisions and some of them with more than one. Okay, so we applied the new program to those. First thing, speed limit must be between 25 and 30. And when we did that, we had one drop out. Next was daily volume must exceed 400 vehicles per day. When we applied that, we had, I think, 3 or 4 drop out. We had 5 drop out. And we didn't have any that were over 4,000. And then we had to have it where the 85th percentile speed was 3 miles per hour or higher than the speed limit. When we applied that, we had a few more drop out. So out of the 19 requests, 8 met the requirements. We had 2 in Creek Club, Beltier, Trayburn Manor, Avonsong, Hopewell Plantation, and Wyndham Farms Drive. So that's 2 in the Crooked Creek neighborhood, and then 1 in the other 6 listed. That color came out a little rough. It might be better on your sheet. We then took those 8 and ranked them 1 to 8. The first column is which had the highest speeding problem or the highest miles per hour over the speed limit. So if you look there, Trayburn Manor had the highest speed problem. We then ranked them by volume, which road carried the most traffic, 1 through 8. Then we did a factor, I guess you could call it, where we multiplied the speed over the speed limit times the volume to get a number, and then ranked that number, and that was that 3rd column. So you could think of that as how many vehicles are traveling how many miles per hour over the speed limit. And then finally, we averaged those three numbers together to arrive at the fourth column, which is what we use to finally rank the sites. So out of the 8 sites that met the requirements, Creek Club Drive, north of State Route 9, is the top-ranked problem that we had. So where do we go from here? First, the city will notify all requesters, the ones that did qualify and did not, let them know why or why not. And then the concept meetings with the qualifying sites are where the city will produce a concept drawing and discussion of what could be done on that street. Once those are presented to those HOAs, it is then up to them to collect their 75% signatures where you agree to the problem or the solution to the problem and to fund their 50%. Come back to the city, and then it could be constructed. Okay. Anything I left out, Carter? Or anything to add? Any questions? Or
Okay.
I had a couple. What exactly will be constructed? Are we talking about a speed hump, a speed bump, a speed table?
That's
Do we know?
a good question. I forgot to mention. The concept statement will address that. They'll look at the situation. For example, if you're on a really sharp downgrade, you don't want to have a bump. There's different factors. The concept portion would address that. And also the 50-50 split is where the city would pay 50% of what would work there. But if the HOA wanted to upgrade that, say they wanted to have brick pavers instead of a plastic or rubber speed bump, they would be responsible for that additional portion.
Okay, what about for roads that may not have qualified because they had under 400? Are we going to offer anything to those people if they want to pay a greater percentage of it or anything else, or we just say, oh, you don't qualify?
We do have first off, if a area wants to have one and they qualify, they can pay more than 50% just to expedite that process. If they don't qualify, the best result would probably be to pay for the counts to be carried out again to see if it qualifies at that point. And this whole process is for a public request. If the Department of Public Works thinks that something is needed, they don't have to go through this. They could just go in and carry that out from a public safety standpoint. This is just for somebody actually the public requested.
And what about gravel roads when 25 miles per hour may be too fast on them, but that may be what the average speed is?
We didn't address gravel.
We're probably the only place around that has speed humps on gravel roads.
Yeah.
And I think one thing to keep in mind is that lower threshold, that 400 vehicles per day, is certainly something that is up for discussion.
Okay.
Yeah.
We wanted to set that threshold at some point where it would make sense to spend city dollars on those types of facilities. And that's administrative guidelines. The policy can be written such that that's the threshold that staff looks at and can approve from a staff level. If it doesn't meet those guidelines, there can always be an appeal process in that where they could appeal the decision of staff to Board of Zoning Appeals, Mayor and City Council. I would think probably Mayor and City Council in this case because it would be an expenditure of city funds. And so that could be worked into the overall policy.
Any questions? Alan?
Yeah, I have a couple questions. Thank you for the good present. I learned a lot. That was good. One of the questions I had to do with who determines what type of calming was installed. So you've already answered that. One of the other questions I have, you answered, which was what if this was initiated by Public Works, which we would pay 100% of that. The other thing is, I can see a subdivision. Let's say that there's one particular part of the subdivision that's affected by this. The greater majority of the rest of the subdivision is not. However, it could be that the affected homeowners would be willing to foot the 50% of the cost and not have to involve all of the neighborhood. And because 75% is pretty hard to get, especially when you're not even affected by the issue. And so I would think if the affected homeowners were willing to foot the bill, that it could be just those affected homeowners, not necessarily the entire neighborhood.
So theoretically, one person wanted to pay all of it,
Mhm.
and just, they'd be the ones that would pay and not have to get any signatures. I mean, the percentages could be changed, as Carter mentioned, but we put that in just to, there would be cases where only maybe a couple homeowners would be affected by that stretch of road, but we put it in just to get the neighborhood consensus that they'd want that in their neighborhood.
Well, Shannon or Sarah, correct me if I'm wrong, but doesn't the policy, at least the existing policy, also talk about affected property owners versus the entire subdivision?
Yeah.
That Public Works can make a determination that a smaller percentage
Correct.
of that subdivision, or just the subdivision, portion of the subdivision that's affected, would fall under these guidelines.
I mean, I would think that if you were requiring, like upping dues to require everyone to pay for it, then they would in fact be affected.
Yeah.
But if it was just 30 homeowners who wanted to foot the 50% of the bill, then the rest of the homeowners association shouldn't have any problem.
And Public Works defines the neighborhood. What population has to be made up of that 75%.
I guess it's certainly worth more discussion, because I would wonder if you would open up a can of worms. Let's say you have one street and maybe there's only one neighbor that's affected, like you said, Alan, and was willing to foot the bill. But let's say the rest of the neighborhood was affected because they had to drive through there, and maybe they were against that. So
Or maybe they didn't want the speed bump.
yeah, that's what I'm saying. So I could see where you'd have to have some kind of balance to where one person wouldn't just say, well, I don't want anyone to speed in front of my house, so they put foot the bill and put a speed hump in the.
Right.
So the effect goes beyond just the money. It's the effect of what's it going to do to you if you drive, because you're going to be driving over it. Maybe you don't want speed bumps in your neighborhood.
True.
Correct.
That's right.
Okay, I can see that.
And that percentage of the other cities and counties we looked at varied from 50% up to 90% approval by the neighborhood.
What
So
was the average?
60, 65 to 75.
I was going to say, because to change your covenants, normally it's 67%,
Yeah.
most of them. So this would rise even higher than that. I did have one more question, I believe. The existing ones, the top 8 that you came up with,
Mhm.
is the qualifying fee for those going to be waived since they came in before
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
And then one other question, and I guess how many we could do, assuming all 8 of those said, yeah, we'll do it, we'll pay our money. I'm assuming we don't have money to pay 50% of all those, so how would we deal with that?
Well, that's a good question, and still up for discussion, I think. John took a quick look at some of the costs before the meeting. In Gwinnett County, for a typical speed hump, speed table type construction was $1,800 for each of those, ranging all the way up to maybe $15,000 to $20,000 if you're looking at the intersection type. So there is a finite budget on that. And this year we have $35,000 in our budget, which would be $70,000 total if you were looking at a 50-50 split for these measures. And so how that gets broken out over that list, I think still has to be determined.
So 1,800 would be like 3 little bumps on one street.
One.
Or hump. I like humps better than
And it
bumps.
goes up from there. And one thing to keep in mind is that's a Gwinnett County cost that we got. So that's based on a much larger program. Whether or not we could piggyback off that and get that same cost would be still have to be determined too. So, I mean, you could have in your mind that this basic speed table is going to probably run $2,000 to $3,000, and that would probably get us in the ballpark for those. And it'll go up from there depending on the type of the measure employed.
Based on that unit cost there, then could we not come up with a cost for each one of these roads in here based on the length of it?
Yes, sir. You can, and if you took in general, we looked at one of the subdivisions on that list would be probably in the neighborhood of $15,000 to $20,000. Is that what we came up with on that? 10 humps. So Yeah, probably in the $15,000 to $20,000 if you were just looking at the vertical deflection versus some of the horizontal measures. I mean, what we would like to probably do in some of these initial ones is get a general mix of some of these different kinds of measures, so you could have an idea about installation costs, the effectiveness maybe of some of them, effectiveness either by themselves or in combination with other types of things. So I would hope that some of these initial ones would have a variety of these traffic calming measures in them.
I have a question on your matrix, the overall ranking summary. Could you go through the mathematics on that? I
Yeah.
can't seem to follow it.
The first column is just the speed ranking 1 to 8. So Trayburn Manor had the highest speed over the speed limit, and Avonsong Crossing had the least amount, or yes, call it not least speeding, but the lowest speed over the speed limit. The second one is just the volumes on that roadway. So, for example, Trayburn Manor, you had a lot of people speeding. Well, I wouldn't say a lot of people. You had high degree of speeding, but it was the 5th highest volume, so you might not have as many people speeding. Whereas, for example, Creek Club Drive is the 2nd worst speeding and the 2nd highest volume, so you have a lot of people driving really fast. That third one is just a factor we developed multiplying the speed times the volume. So it's not this ranking, it's the actual speed. 37 miles per hour times 2,000 vehicles per day, and got a number, and then ranked it according to that. And then the third one is just simply an average of those 3 numbers, 2, 2, and 1. So you could rank them by whichever factor. If you just want to go by, okay, which one has the highest speeds, then we could rank them by that. Which one affects the most vehicles, you could go by volume. You want to get a combination of those two, you could go by the combined ranking. And then the average is just averaging those 3.
I have a few questions related to budget, but I think you answered most of them probably to the best of the information that you probably currently have. I mean, it would be nice to know what a comparison is of these various high-speed bumps, lumps, and whatever the case may be.
Humps and tables.
And also the difference in the material types, because I'm certain that these subdivisions that are at a very high, I'm not on anyways, it doesn't matter. At a high level, our high home costs are gonna want, you know, a much higher grade of material used in these, devices, actual bumps or lumps. What's the process, though, with the public after the determination is made? So we've got the ranking here, and we say that Creek Club Drive, you know, definitely needs something. I think we've known that, so I'm happy actually to see that there's an affirmation here. And I do have a question about how this determination was made, if you went out and did new studies on all of these subdivisions. And then, what's the process now that the determination is made that it should be, that this subdivision should be?
The ranking we did was just for the existing backlog. So it's kind of a special case to clear out what's already there. The request that came in before the program was in place.
So you used the numbers that we already had, or did you go out?
We
and-
collected speed and traffic data early December of '08.
Okay, and so then what, maybe this is a question for Carter, I don't know, what would be the process now that the determination is made that, yes, okay, you do qualify, you're high on our list, now what's the next step?
The city would develop the concept drawings, and present those to each of the HOAs, saying here's your problem, this is what we think the best solution is for that problem. This is how much it would cost, your portion of it would cost. And then that HOA or individual, whatever the case may be, would have to go out and get the 75% signatures. bring those back, and then the construction installation would take place. So once all the concept drawings were out and all the HOAs had been met with, it could be the group that ranked 8th on our site could be the first one to have it installed if they got their signatures first. So once you have the meetings, once you have the concept drawings and meet with the HOAs, it's up to them to go to that next step by getting the signatures and the commitments to pay the 50%.
In doing your evaluation, and this may be more of an opinion statement or request, in doing your evaluation around the country of the different types of traffic calming devices and materials, how often do you see roads being gated or other types of things happening with the roads that, not just putting in speed bumps, but other types of devices?
Completely closing it off.
Well, yeah. Are
That's-
other types of deterrents, are there other types of deterrents that you see?
The big one is on-street parking, trees, narrower streets, things like that when you have new roads or even retrofitting older roads, where you don't want people to have the perception that they can drive over the speed limit. You want it to be kind of tight, kind of, I really should have to drive 25. You don't want it where I could drive 50. It doesn't matter what the sign says. So that's the big common one, is to design the subdivisions that way to begin with.
On-street parking, you said, that's interesting. That would be a
That's why
conscious
Crabapple was done that way.
deterrent, because we have some subdivisions that have actually, they're concerned about on-street parking, but maybe that is a way to turn it around in a positive.
Yeah, it provides friction there, that there's, 2,000-pound thing of steel 5 feet away from me, I'm going to slow down. Same thing with trees, too. Tree-lined road, if you go too fast, you go off hit a tree. If there's, 50 feet of clear zone there, then you're not as worried about that.
Yeah, it's a drag strip, I guess. So you're seeing a lot of those types of things consciously.
Oh, yeah,
being
yeah.
developed.
Definitely.
Anything else other than that? I'm just trying to get a feel for all the different things since we're about to embark on something that we'll be making determinations on.
I know that the all-out road closure ones have declined a lot. Some places have put in, I think they're called bullers. That's what they're, the concrete posts that can actually collapse for emergency vehicles to get through. But during the rest of the time, they're up, just concrete posts basically, sticking up to block vehicular traffic. But the majority of it, I would say now, is lumps, humps, raised intersection, raised crosswalks. Another one you have is where when a pedestrian's crossing a crosswalk, there's lights in the actual pavement that will blink. So at night, you can see that blinking, knowing somebody's walking up ahead of you.
Makes noise too.
Yeah, the chirping bird.
How often do you see kind of deterrence in kind of gates that the road's not closed and the gate's not really there to keep people out, but it's there as a, I don't know, an enhancement, for lack of a better term, an enhancement, but it's also a deterrent because you got to go through this almost awning type thing to get into the subdivision. So it gives the impact of gated, but you're not actually stopping or preventing people from coming. They can come on
Just
through, but it
makes them slow down so they won't use it as cut through. Yeah, you see that some.
I think Tina had a good point, too, and you addressed it a little bit on when we talked about upgrading materials and whatnot, and talked about the affected citizens or whatever could absorb the additional cost, and I'm going to assume that would be from the baseline cost, they would absorb all the additional costs, not just 50%.
That's right.
That way
That's right.
it would be on an even, as far as our citizens are concerned, it's on an even basis for the city's cost.
That's right. We would have a standard detail for each of these measures that we would pay 50% of.
Of the standard.
Of the standard. Anything above that would be all on the applicant.
Okay, and then these rankings that you guys got and studies, was that based on the cities? Or where did these come from when you ranked these 8?
Those are ranked off of the count, speed and volume counts that we took in December.
That you guys took?
Correct.
But did the city do some additional or different ones, or is this in, do you know, Carter?
We've done some additional ones on certain streets, but all of these, I think, were based on traffic counts done by Street Smarts at the time of the study.
My specific question, for example, is Crooked Creek. I know they've had some done, the city had had some done, and I didn't know if this is.
This would be an
Independent.
addition to those, right?
Correct.
Yeah, right.
Thank you.
Julie?
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, it's very helpful. In terms of the design process, I know that you've now ranked these. What is the timing in terms of beginning to conduct the actual assessment of each of these 8? I mean, are you envisioning beginning this in the next week, 2 weeks, next month?
Well, I think what we wanted to do was get some feedback from everyone on the overall program, and then go back and go ahead and complete, take any comments into consideration, complete the program, complete the ordinance, make any modifications to that need to be done, and then come back with the final program.
So ordinance completion first, and then go back out to these 8 to say, here's what we would specifically recommend. From a design standpoint, and obviously we've heard it from several folks, and Carter, as you think about these different designs, obviously the Design Review Board is one of our entities that I would just
That's right.
recommend that we consider the existing overlays, because obviously I'd hope, want to be consistent with what we're expecting businesses to do in our own communities. And even with some of that baseline opportunity for speed enhancement, meaning to reduce speed, if we could look at a baseline that would be consistent with some of our overlays, whether it be the Highway 9 area or the Milton overlays, I just think that that's important because it's obviously a design element that speaks to our rural character, even in the Highway 9 areas as well as our internal areas. And in terms of the cost of those, I think, again, assessing what that baseline is going to be, a baseline here versus a baseline in Gwinnett might be a little bit different.
Correct.
Because I would hope that we would be more design sensitive here in Milton. In terms of costs and collecting those up front, did I hear you, I know that the petition, the 75% needs to be collected up front to obviously affirm that 75% of the homeowners would want that. Are we also anticipating upfront collection of those fees? What's that process?
There's a $155 fee for 2009, and that's to cover going out and doing the volume and speed count.
Yes, I'm sorry. I meant the actual cost. Once we have
Construction costs?
Yes, the construction costs. Are we anticipating collecting that up front, or is
Yes.
that pay over time as an
Collect
upfront
upfront.
collection? And then I guess my other question just has to do with coordination with our transportation master plan, and I'm assuming that that's in the works. Is that fair to say? That the design for these would parlay with what we're doing from a transportation master planning process? I know we've got Kimberly Horn here in the audience, but
I don't know that it would really work into that. This program is really on the local roads only, and so I don't know that this would affect that in any significant way.
okay, and I guess my suggestion would be to at least just have the conversation to make sure that none of what they're doing wouldn't either complement what you've already done, just since it's all transportation related.
One of the things that might be very appropriate is that in this, we're having quite a conversation about roundabouts, for example, with our stakeholder advisory committee and interest in where those things could be placed in the community or considered appropriately. And I think that certainly in the sections where we talk about those kinds of things, we can include a reference to the work that's being done here that's more directed to local roads, which is really not the focus of the
Right.
transportation plan.
Right.
But we could still include a reference to this so that it's clear that it's all very collaborative and it's consistent with the no develop approach.
And again, it may be that one obviously is more focused on local roads than the other, but just in case there's some, from a design standpoint as an example, so that we have some cross-collateralization. The other would be, I believe that Kimberly Horn has done some assessment about gravel roads as an example. And so even though we don't have any current requests on our gravel roads, it would sure seem that we'd want to identify what would be some design approaches if ever we need to look at reducing speed or having some traffic calming on those roads. And rather than to wait for that request, I would just hope that we could go ahead and look at some design options that are rural in nature as opposed to maybe some things that have been installed in the past simply because maybe they didn't know what other options existed.
And that would be one I would expect would probably come back to mayor and council, because what we've seen so far on the rural or the gravel roads is that they don't get to that 400 vehicles per day threshold.
But maybe there's just some other things that we could be doing when we're out maintaining those roads that really complement traffic reduction at the same time that we're maintaining the roads.
And the maintenance of it brings up a good point in that with the speed humps and speed tables, those vertical type deflections, generally in the past, any roads considered for LARP funding, they won't qualify under that. And so with these traffic type measures, the vertical type deflections, that becomes city maintenance. So just one thing to consider on those.
That's an important part to consider. Like, a lot of cities are weary about what exactly you do. Like when you add pavers, which your homeowners might incur that additional cost, but just think about long-term maintenance of things like pavers. And if the city then takes that on, it becomes harder to overlay the road. It's not saying that you can't be done; it can be done. Just something maybe to protect the city in the long run.
That's a good point.
But if the neighborhood wanted to do that.
One other place where we need to ensure that the coordination between this effort, our effort, that's related.
I'm sorry, but if y'all wouldn't mind coming to the microphone, because unfortunately, we can't pick up what you're saying. Thank
No,
you.
One of the things that seems like it would be very appropriate in terms of the coordination of all of these efforts is also with the comp planning effort and working with Alice. We're doing that quite a bit already anyway. But in terms of some of the questions that you got to about when he was talking about tree-lined streets and on-site or on-street parking and things like how you actually lay out roads within subdivisions, it's really more a part of your comp planning and land use planning activities, because roads that are more like this also influence how fast people tend to go down the road. It just makes for a more calmer, and people tend to drive slower. So anyway, that's the kind of coordination, but we have been doing a lot of that, and I just think we just need to be sure we bring this piece into it.
Thank you.
Trying to envision how this would play out. Say, for example, Creek Club Drive, which is over a mile long. Who's going to determine what type of calming device is going to be installed there? Or, like you say, it could be a combination. So who's going to be the ultimate judge, I guess? I can see rule by committee, casting no aspersions on folks in Creek Club Drive, but you have 640 homeowners there. Well, some of them may want to have a chicane in front of their house. Next guy may want a speed hump, and next one's going to neck down, and down there at the corner of Wolf Close, they may want a roundabout there. Who's going to be the arbitrator or the mediator or the final judge in determining which devices go in there?
Right now, the way it's written, it'll be the city, essentially Public Works, to make those decisions.
Well, I can see this playing out.
Ideally, what you would like to do is to come to some sort of agreement with the homeowners association and work through. If somebody wants a specific type in front of their lot, maybe you can get there. We have a cost share in this, so you can't go through and pick the most expensive one at every intersection. So there is a juggling act that goes on, but somebody ultimately has to be the one to make the decision, and since it's a public street, it needs to be the city.
Well, I think we need to have some teeth in that ordinance then to force a final decision and make someone the final arbitrator an issue like that. Make it specific. I could see this thing playing out for an extended period of time in some of these neighborhoods.
It could. And just like the determination as to whether or not it meets the standards, and the city may say you don't qualify for it, and they have the option to go to mayor and council on an appeal, they would have that same avenue if they didn't like the mix or they didn't like the plan that was prepared. They could appeal that to mayor and council too.
Okay, now in the voting, individual neighborhoods voting on it, is this the entire neighborhood, or would it be just the folks on that particular roadway?
Well, it's 75% of the affected property owners as determined by Public Works, I think is the way it's written now.
Who's affected then?
Well, it may be the whole neighborhood.
Seem like the tributaries would
Would
be.
it be adjoining neighborhoods, say Francis Road and Highway 9?
Yeah, it's really ambiguous the way it's in the current policy right now, and you could say Well, it's part of Cobb County and half of Cherokee County that's affected by these sorts of things. I think what we would try to do is narrow that down, and it's the affected property owners who are going to be footing the bill for this.
Seems like we're talking about parallel issues here.
Yeah.
When you're looking at these other ordinances for other cities, and the council has heard me say this before, I lived in Parkbrook in Alpharetta, and we went through the same process. We got 75%. It took us a couple of years to do it, to get 75% of the homeowners, and it was the homeowners in Parkbrook, that 350 homes, I think it was, to vote to approve it, and then the city of Alpharetta put them in, and then the process actually went pretty seamlessly, I should say. In Parkbrook, in the design, and it looks, I mean, the subdivision looks great. I moved from there because of the traffic, because it was a thoroughfare between Milton, Old Milton Parkway and Kimball Bridge Road. But it seemed to go pretty seamlessly, and they've got a variety, actually, of these calming devices. One roundabout and lots of the wider lumps, I guess is what they call them, and a lot of greenery. That process wasn't exhaustive.
I have a couple questions. As far as the bidding process, because I know we have a stake in this, but I know the HOAs have a stake in this too. And let's assume that we've said, okay, great, you qualify. How are we going to bid that job out? Because I'm sure, like anything else, you probably have a wide range of costs from different companies for doing the job. So how are we going to determine which company is? Are we going to take the lowest bid, or are we going to get 3 bids?
We'll go through our standard city procurement process. And so after the initial concept design, if it's below a certain dollar threshold, it may be 3 bids, 3 verbal quotes, 3 written quotes. If it breaks that threshold, $50,000, then it'll go out through the formal bid process.
Okay. Couple things. One, could someone compare for me the difference? I mean, I know the difference between them, but I guess the effectiveness of horizontal, like was it chicanes, when you have the things like this, and you've got the greenery and stuff on it, versus like speed bumps. Because I can see in terms of these neighborhoods, they're going to want the chicanes, I would think, because it looks a little better, I would think, than the speed bumps. But
The horizontal items have typically less maintenance costs because vehicles aren't literally driving them. They're avoiding them.
right.
Whereas the humps, lumps, and bumps, cars are going over it every day. So that's a big consideration. The vertical ones are usually a lot cheaper, can go in a lot faster. If they need to be removed for some reason, they're a lot easier to remove. Just literally unbolting it from the ground, carrying it off. Whereas the horizontal ones, you'd have to redo,
The whole string.
knock out the planters or whatever's in there. So those are some of the major considerations.
Which one works better? Because I've seen people gun it from one speed bump to the other, and I've seen also people use it like a racetrack, go
Yeah, a lot of people will make up that speed in between the bumps.
Does it depend on the traffic count too? Is there a certain traffic count that you can't put the horizontal and have to put the vertical, or is it?
You know any of that, John? Not that I know of.
I think in the thresholds of traffic that we're looking at, they're probably all appropriate.
Yeah.
Have you looked at traffic calming for roads that are over 30 miles per hour? Because we've got a lot of roads over 30 miles per hour that we need some kind of traffic calming on.
We did not include that. Most areas don't consider that a local road anymore. So a big consideration of the local road is that you have more of a neighborhood environment, and most places, anything above 30 is going to be more commercial, retail.
We have open road neighborhoods.
We have open roads, yeah.
Is that something y'all are going to handle?
What's the speed reduced
Yes.
on the local road?
Yeah, we specifically are considering open road neighborhoods. That's a very unique term to the city of Milton.
We're a unique city.
I know. And so we are specifically considering the concerns and considerations of the open road neighborhoods and how we can achieve some of the traffic calming activity on those kinds of roads.
Because you can
with
do
that kind of
roundabouts on those
residential
kind of
development.
roads where you necessarily can't do a speed
Right.
hump or something.
Correct.
And are you also looking at some of the horizontal, I mean, obviously, trees and more narrow roads, and even where you have a road now, I mean, you can provide some of these choking mechanisms. So are those all things then that you're considering for those?
We're gonna look at the
Roadways.
full array of activities that could be, and we're just gonna have to figure out, open road neighborhoods really are quite a unique thing. It's not like we can go and find something where there's already been quite a bit of research done on that. So balancing sort of the safety considerations of those kinds of roadways with the kinds of residential development that is typical to this area along those kinds of roadways.
Yes.
And the kinds of speed considerations, trying to bring the speeds down that you're trying to achieve, figuring out how to achieve that in a safe way from a physical as well as enforcement and some of those other kinds of policy things is all gonna have to be a part of it.
Because I'm assuming that if you know, as pretty as the trees would be lighting the streets on some of these, if you do that, then you're not gonna have the sight distances you need to be able to use radar. Is that correct?
But that would probably have an impact.
I mean,
Sure, I'll answer since I'm at the microphone. Probably. There would be, anytime you decrease sight distance, you have a problem with speed enforcement in some capacity, but you also have problems with people that are leaving their driveways, for example, that you don't want to terribly limit that sight distance.
I think some of it is, when you come into some of the neighborhood nodes and things, it doesn't have to be along all roads, but in some of the areas, and what I'm hearing is that there's gonna be different considerations for different areas, that hopefully speak.
They're gonna have to be rather uniquely cited, I think,
Right.
what the considerations are for that particular.
Sure, and it depends on the road and the vertical, it just, obviously lots of considerations. But that's gonna be then more in the transportation master planning initiative than it is with street smarts.
It will, because that's gonna be, as he said, that's gonna be above that local roads that we are not including, but everything above that will be a part of the city.
Did you all run, in your review, did you run across any policies that allowed for this type of traffic calming? I know by definition it may not be called calming, but traffic calming specifically to reduce volume, like in neighborhoods versus speed, just not even to mention speed.
Some of the older ones, but
Older ones.
pretty much everything I've seen that's been done the last 15 years has been worded more towards speed control.
But don't they sometimes, if you reduce the speed, then you're automatically gonna reduce some of the volume? I mean, you may not wanna say that that's the reason why it's being done, but isn't that kind of an outcome of it?
Could happen.
Yeah, but you got to use speed to qualify. That's the only.
And, I mean, like a place, for example, when I was in college, they had the university areas right off an interstate. So you'd have people used to driving 60, 70, 80 miles per hour dumped into a heavy pedestrian area. So there they had rumble strips, pavers, and everything as you're coming off the ramp into the area, just to kind of trick the driver into realizing, hey, I need to slow down because I was driving 80. I'm used to that. I've been driving 80 for 4 hours. Now I'm dumped in somewhere where I have to go down to 25. So you see it a lot there too, where it's not so much, I don't know how to put it, transition, I guess, slowing down people going from a really fast area to a pedestrian area. You see it a lot in those areas lately.
Where does the clear safety zone requirement kick in?
Well,
Beside safety zone along the shoulder of the road, what speed or level of volume, where does that kick in?
well, I think it will kick in for really any of these. Once you get above the 400 vehicles per day, now you're talking about a higher volume. You get out of the low volume road type classification. So you do have to start looking at those types of safety measures. The tree line streets and those things, it's a consideration. Most of these that we're looking at are very low volume, though. We're down around 400 or 500 vehicles per day. So in this residential setting, I think most of these are going to be okay. When you start getting out into the larger roads and the higher speeds, I think that Kimley Horn will be looking at, then I think you do have some real serious considerations in looking at some of these traffic control calming measures.
Is there a GDOT standard that controls that?
Yeah, it's an AASHTO standard, and it's going to be based on speed and volume on the road. So generally, I think most of these are going to be below those standards, though. It will be a consideration. I mean, it certainly is something we'll look at on a case-by-case basis.
Any other questions or comments?
So are you guys looking for direction from us as far as whether this existing framework is okay? Is that what you're doing?
Any comments, questions? We'll take all of this information that we've heard tonight and try and go back and develop the final product to bring back to council.
I do have one more question. Why did you recommend to go from a 75-25 split with the city paying more in our current ordinance if we approved some to the 50-50 split?
It was mainly looking at similar programs around the country. I don't think I saw any that were at any lower than 50% public contribution, and most of them were higher than that.
Do you recall the cities, the immediate sister cities?
I don't.
Repeat that again. You said you don't recall.
Any that, none of them, the very lowest was 50-50 split. I didn't see any where the city was paying more than 50%. And majority of them, the homeowners were paying higher than 50. So.
And just out of curiosity, and Chris, I don't know if you or Carter, even if you do, and obviously we're no longer Fulton County, but previously, what was the split with unincorporated Fulton? Do you know? I think it was where the citizens were paying a much higher percentage. So this, I think, actually benefits.
I think you're right.
Citizenry.
I think you're right.
I think historically, the citizens were paying almost 100% because the point being on these local roads, very few citizens, for the most part, fewer citizens are using this. So the taxpayers, obviously, that live off these roads didn't want to bear the burden of the cost. And so I think that's why you've got a split on local roads when you've got relatively low volume. Is historically, I think, how.
When I mentioned that 50-50 split to some folks who dealt with it in Fulton County, they thought they were getting a better deal with the 50-50 split than what they got from Fulton, but I don't remember what the percentage was.
I think Fulton County basically.
Yeah, could be.
And I think, too, it depends on, of course, once we get those budgeted figures. Right now, we really don't have any idea as to what the total cost would be. But I think that, at least historically, that was what some of the other jurisdictions have done and why. So that begs the question, why did we have an ordinance recommended that was 75-25?
That being said, and these questions asked, is there comments or direction, basically in general with what's been proposed here, or Carter? Do you guys feel like you've picked up some information and direction just by the questions, or?
Well, I think from what we've heard tonight, we're going to move forward with what we've got here as the basic framework and bring back something very similar to what you've seen tonight. I don't think I've heard anything significantly different.
Fair to say with council?
I was just going to say, I think to Bill's point, we might need to tighten up how the process works, just because you don't want to get bogged down and it costs us a fortune in man hours and time and trying to negotiate what the final design would be. If we've got design guidelines and plans and overlays and, the comprehensive transportation plan and other guidelines that we need to use to get bogged down in a homeowners group or one-off homeowners that want something different than the next homeowner wants. I mean, it would seem like that would be.
I was going to say, just from different homeowners wanting different types of things, you're going to have different neighborhoods wanting different types of things, and I can see an issue if we, for one neighborhood, say, okay, well, we'll pay 50% of a higher price to speed calming, and the other neighborhood, we give you the speed bumps.
Well, I think also we need to be careful because the design costs can get pretty expensive too. So we need to make sure that we're not paying to have a different design every single location that's costing us $5,000-6,000 to design.
Right.
I think what we would, go ahead, Bill, I'm sorry. I was just going to say, I think, what we would do is probably come up with the least cost to solve the problem that we've agreed that they perhaps have. and then use that as a baseline. And then anything, no matter whether it's horizontal, vertical, or whatever, above that would be covered by the
Including the
requester.
design cost stuff,
Yeah.
anything about that.
Is there,
Well, I think most of the design cost is going to be up front. We're going to set specific standards for each different device.
That's right, that's right.
With some modifications dependent on where they are located.
I think I'm envisioning 4 or 5 standard details and being able to select from those. We'd have some general costs from previous projects associated with those. So as each project comes in, the hardest part's going to be this initial part of the program where we've got eight communities in right now and a limited budget. You know, once we get through these first 8, it'll be on a first come, first serve basis. And you know, if it takes them 2 years to decide that what they want to do or to get their signatures, then that's fine. They'll be subject to whatever budgetary constraints we have at the time they get their side squared away. But these first 8 are going to be difficult, and I think we still need to work through a fair process to get them in and get them through the system with the limited amount of money that we have for this fiscal year.
Will they be through the system in this fiscal year, though? Because the fiscal year ends in September. Are we going to get the design standards and the project completed and their signatures and all within this year? Or is that going to be something that goes over to next year?
Well, it will probably go over to next year. I know some of the communities are ready to go now.
I bet some of them will say, never mind.
Some may say never mind. Some may have a difficult time getting the signatures. But I know that some are ready now. And there's nothing in the policy that says each community can only use 50% of the budget or a set dollar amount assigned to each community. So the first one could come in
And I guess that's just one, maybe 2 additional thoughts, is that one, hopefully the language will be clear, both from the staff perspective and then also legally, that there are budget constraints, so that we don't set an expectation that citizens think, great, if I've met this criteria, we're going to get it if we're willing to spend that 50%. So I think we need to be very clear about that in addition to process. The other is that knowing that we do have a limited budget, and we don't yet have an assessment of what these suggestions would be for these 8, is that 50-50 split going to be the best approach initially, knowing that we've got 8? Because if we know that we have 8 that we'd love to be able to solve, but the 50-50 split doesn't allow for us to accomplish everything except for, say, the first 4 or 5, would we at least want to consider a different split in order to provide kind of equal opportunity, if you would, to all neighborhoods? And then I guess my third question, this is going to be one that perhaps our city attorney can address as we go through the ordinance, but just from a discriminatory standpoint, I think that whole premise of fairness, obviously some people in the community may or may not feel they've got a greater opportunity to expend more dollars, and I think we need to be cautious that we don't set ourselves up to be allowing those that may have just a deeper pocketbook to put in some safety measures. And I'm not sure how we find that balance, but I just think we need to be cautious when we think through that language.
Maybe when we come back with a final program, we can come back with an idea of costs of these and have that discussion again about what we think the overall program is going to cost in this initial stage.
Because quite honestly, something like Creek Club Drive may, because of the number of signatures they may have to get, may take them longer than Wyndham Farms. But yet, if we only have a set amount of money, I don't think it ought to go to the lower priority ones. We got to find a way to balance that.
So it is not a specific science. I just think we have to think through those various issues.
Is there a need, to Bill's point, is there a need to define what affected homeowners mean?
There is, and we'll work on that.
Okay. And the other question I have is, since these neighborhoods turned in their requests prior to any change that might be forthcoming, is it an ordinance that we would pay 25, 75, 75, 25? And if so, and they've asked for that evaluation to be done under the current ordinance, then are we still going to be paying 75% for that? Or can we now pass a new ordinance and they be subject to the new ordinance? They put in the request before that.
Well, it is in ordinance format, and Ken might be able to speak to this a little bit, unless we went back and established some guideline that said, we're not going to hear any requests until we adopt this new policy. These requests may be heard under that old ordinance.
Right, certainly some precedent for that. If you submit your application pursuant to a certain ordinance, then you get to be reviewed under that ordinance. I'll just have to look at it and get some feedback back to you.
That's a big difference in money.
Does the current ordinance give these different criteria to rank them?
No.
It does give you the volume and speed criteria. It does, doesn't it?
Not specific numbers, but it says that they will be ranked and prioritized by volume and speed. And it says depending on the limited budget, they will be prioritized. So that is correct.
Yeah, the current ordinance is pretty broad. It's not near as specific as this.
No.
Hopefully it gives us a way to not have to pay 75%, because we only get one or two done if we do that.
Or done.
But it sounds like it does give broad perspective and allows staff to be able to make some good decisions.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Very
Thank
helpful.
you. We adjourning for?
We, if we could take it's all right with staff and council, take a quick break. Come back for our other.
6:12.
insulted him when I said this wasn't gonna be at the really good session.
We're gonna start with a,
The traffic
He's
calming.
got some tricks for us. or something.
Serena.
Yeah, that was pavement. Traffic calming's more interested in pavement.
Well,
Depends on who you are.
That's true.
If you're a paver,
It's very exciting.
you like to pave. All right, do we have everybody here? I think so, except for Chris. Probably get started.
Do you want to get started? Can you hear me? No, can we? Oh, she's going to start? Okay.
Presentation on pavement management plan. Mr. Carter Lucas?
I'll turn it over to Kimley Horn. Angela Priest is going to get us started for our discussion on the pavement management plan.
The pavement management plan is a portion of what Kimley Horn is doing for the city of Milton as part of the comprehensive transportation plan. And so we're going to talk about that piece and most specifically getting you guys prepared for your capital improvement projects and budget. And again, I'm Angela Priest from Kimley Horn. We also have Craig West and Faye DeMassimo, which I believe you all have met here to help answer your questions and run through what we've done so far on the pavement management piece. There's two boards up here. You also have it in your handouts. Might be an easier way for you to see it. But the city of Milton had a pavement management study done, a pretty extensive one, that inventoried all of your roadways, your paved roadways. I think it was about 190 miles. Infrastructure management systems did this study for you. But now Kimley Horn has been asked to review what they've done, put a little more local thought to it, and specifically recommend some projects for your budget for this year, which has already been mentioned goes in October. And I believe that process starts in June to determine what your capital projects will be. So the first piece of that was to review the study from IMS. Again, they used and it's like an automated van. It basically has a lot of sensors on it. It actually measures a bunch of distresses on your pavement, cracks, ruts, the surface ride, how you feel in your car, if it's vibration, and gives it basically a score or an index. The study also uses a software program that will allow it, given different budget scenarios, give you an understanding of how good or bad your infrastructure as a whole is, what some of the things you need to do to keep up that infrastructure, and how to manage it so you don't have a lot of backlog. So your roadways as a network are staying well maintained, that they're not going below a level of service that you would want. So our first piece of this was kind of review what they did, understand their condition index, and understand their recommendations, and then see if there was ways that we could improve upon those to provide you something that was a little bit more useful and a little bit more tangible. So we did review that report, and we also drove about every city-owned road in Milton and compared it with the values that the IMS study looked at. And basically you'll see the rating is a PCI. It's a pavement condition index. It's a standard testing method. It's an ASTM standard that measures different distress things like I just mentioned, cracking, rutting, surface texture. And then it uses a GDOT procedure to weight those to determine your overall rating. 0 being your worst, completely failed road, 100 being the best case. So a newly paved road would have a rating of 100. So in the city of Milton, the area weighted PCI value that IMS determined when they drove the roads in 06 was 57. 70 is a very good number. A lot of cities or counties look to reach 70. That's a very good pavement. 57 is to some acceptable. It's certainly not terrible. It's certainly not bad. When Craig and I drove the roads and did basically a windshield survey to verify these numbers, we felt comfortable with 57. We also felt comfortable on the individual roadway PCI values. Of course, some roads have gotten worse since 06. Some roads have also been funded and paved since 06, 07. So we took those into account and took notes of those. So we looked at the PCI values, and we also, a lot of these pavement management are kind of like I call them black boxes. You put a lot of information in, and then you get something out and you don't really understand exactly what happens in the black box. And so what we did is look at that, make sure we understood it, make sure we felt that it was something that made sense for Milton and something that made sense from George's perspective. And we felt like their recommendations were pretty useful. There was definitely some things that were in there that the city of Milton would not do based on the rating. So say the IMS study might say some of these roads you see have a pretty low PCI value. They might just say you need to tear that road up from the subgrade and rebuild it. Is that really practical? Is that really something we have the funding for? Is that really something that the city of Milton is going to undertake? Probably not. Are there other alternatives that could provide a better road that would be a better use of your funds? Absolutely. So that's basically what we looked at. So we took the outputs of all of this information that IMS did, and we looked to see, along with input from your Department of Public Works folks, some other priorities, which when Craig talks about the CIP in depth, he'll talk about those. But we looked at all these different priorities and felt that IMS was a good starting point, but we needed to apply some other thoughts to it as well. So this is kind of on this side, the 06-07 survey and analysis. This is some of the takeaways that I took away from the report. Like I said, 190 miles of roadway. It analyzes, it's very powerful. It can analyze all these situations. And your area rated PCI value is 57, which we feel good about. And you have a pretty healthy backlog of activities that you need to do to keep up your infrastructure. The major point that IMS made was that you need an annual budget for capital improvement projects of $2.25 million in order to reach a PCI of 70 in the next 10 years with a backlog that's a little more manageable. So that's, if you were to say, that's IMS's recommendation, and we're going to talk about how we feel about that in a minute. And then what we found is that the PCI values are pretty good. Craig's going to talk about what we all are really interested in, which is the cost. How useful is the cost data that IMS did? And basically applying just engineering judgment and your priorities, hopefully, with this meeting to determine your final CIP budget. And with that, I'll turn it over to Craig.
Yeah, like Angela said, I mean, we need to go back and take a look. Pavement management, I guess I'll give a little background on what exactly pavement management is. Angela touched a little bit on what the PCI values, what pavement management is, why it's useful for a city to have. It just gives you a systematic way to assess what your infrastructure condition is. That's the main reason behind a pavement management system. And IMS used the GBA software, which is a software that the city has, that allows you, based on these different conditions, to prioritize what projects need to be funded, when they need to be done, so on and so forth, and what it's going to cost. From a visual standpoint, which was all this pavement management study is, it's just looking strictly at the surface distresses. So it's not taking into any account structural related distresses, even though the different distress types lead you into what type of mechanisms are causing the different types of distresses. So it really provides you a lot of insight into what's happening with the pavement, how you should maintain it in the future. Like Angela said, area weighted PCI of 57 is acceptable. A lot of cities say 55. Hey, if we can maintain our roads at 55 and spend a reasonable budget, we're happy with that. Some cities say they want 70. They want 75 on their main roads and their arterials. They may accept a PCI of 50 on their local roads. So there's a lot of different things that you can look at, and IMS's study took a real general look. They said they ran a bunch of different budget scenarios, say we have 1.25 million, say we have 2 million, say we have so on and so forth, and tried to come to this number of what it takes to get to an area weighted PCI of 70. That was something that was decided upon with Public Works, that hey, maybe 70 is a number we want to be at. In order to get to that number, like Angela said, $2.25 million a year. Is it realistic? Is it something we can get to? Is that the number we want to be at? Those are great questions that we would like feedback from everyone on what's acceptable, what's not. The one thing that we did notice through our review of IMS's study is one of the major inputs in a pavement management system is, well, three of them, are prioritization, what are we going to do and when are we going to do it, the type of treatment that you're going to do, and lastly, the unit cost. And obviously, the unit costs are the biggest thing because they ultimately determine what the budget number is going to be and what the projects are going to cost. Going through IMS's study, and we don't have the background on where they came up with their unit cost and how they were entailed, but based on recent bids from the area, recent bids that the city of Milton has had, their unit costs were 15 to 30% higher than what we're seeing. Obviously, we're looking short term, we're looking 2 years right now in terms of the CIP. I've seen lately that bid prices are bottom of the barrel. You can steal projects right now. So these numbers may be a little inflated, but that's something that we tried to address is updating the unit cost whenever we were determining these. So what that ultimately impacts is this $2.25 million that's needed. That is based on their budget with inflated unit costs. So this number ultimately could be 1.7 million. It could be 1.5 million. For us, we were not able to access the software that was used by IMS infrastructure. So there is no way for us to readily go back and look at what the impact of change in the unit cost has on that overall number and how much it's going to cost each year to get there. That's something that can be done, I guess, through an update. Generally, a pavement management system, you want to update every 3 to 5 years. And that's obviously something that Angela alluded to. This condition values are based on 2006, 2007 data. So some roads have obviously decreased, some roads the conditions have increased. So that's something that we need to keep in mind as well. And then in terms of developing the CIP, we had a paving budget, what we thought of, we're just told a little different today, but originally $2.4 million was requested. To our knowledge right now, this year, what we have is $1.4 billion. That obviously impacts our table that we have shown in the handouts, but we're just advised of this today at a meeting. So what we did whenever we developed it, like Angela said, was looked at the public and city priorities. We had many discussions with Public Works to figure out, what are your highest priorities, what's changed from the conditions, so on and so forth. The PCI values and distress types were obviously taken into account. If you've got load-related distresses, maybe we want to look at something different in terms of our rehab type. LARP roadways that were submitted for LARP funding. A couple of things to keep in mind with the LARP funding whenever we're developing this is we submit the roadways to the state for funding. It's kind of uncertain right now as to what the results, what we're going to get for LARP funding, but what we do get, any type of pre-overlay repairs that may come out of LARP come out of city dollars. That's something that the city has to fund outside of just the overlay that the LARP funding will provide. So, and then recently rehabilitated roadways were obviously taken into account because the IMS study still shows those as very low PCI values. The public and city priorities really match. It was neat to see after talking with Public Works because the roads that they identified that they thought obviously fell pretty much in line with what we refer to as a worst first strategy in developing the CIP and the pavement management. And what I mean by that from worst first is when it comes to pavement management, you can look at it on two levels. One is like a preventative maintenance level where you want to maintain your better conditioned roadways at the highest level first and then fund your pavements that are in really bad condition. Extends the life of the majority of your pavements, and so on and so forth. What we have gotten into here is that our citywide PCI value has gotten low enough that we want to take this worst first strategy for the first couple years and try to rehabilitate our roads that are really bad. And we want to try to bring up our area weighted PCI for the city. Thus, we'll move to a preventative maintenance type strategy into the future, and that would be to maybe try to attack roads that have PCI values in the 80 to 90 range with surface treatments and so on that really haven't been used much in the city, just to try to maintain them at a higher level, thus having an impact on the area weighted PCI. Future recommendations, that just kind of goes into considering the preventative maintenance strategy. Update unit costs into the future, I think, are very important, obviously, and then update the pavement condition data every 3 to 5 years. So the overall recommended capital paving projects, this obviously goes over our $1.4 million that we're going to have now, but this is prioritized, and you can see in your tables how the priorities came out. So what we'll do from this is just knock off whatever we have to knock off to get down to the $1.4 million budget. So that's Kensington Farms Road was a road that was somewhat a committed road, as we were told, needs to be addressed, and it had somewhat been committed. Morris Road was identified as the highest priority by the city, by far. The Public Works folks felt Morris Road was in the worst condition and needed to be addressed. So we're kind of, as you can tell from the maintenance activity, actually have some different types of reconstruction, because even just driving the road, a lot of load-related distresses and significant deterioration that needs to be completely reconstructed. So we considered some percentages for different overlay and reconstruction types. So Thompson Road, you can see area weighted PCI of 7, and the actual from to locations are in the spreadsheet. So if you want a more specific location of where we're thinking we're going to go. Hickory Flat, Birmingham, and Bethany Road were other priorities that were identified. And even based on the $2 million budget that we had originally, you can see some went unfunded. And then whenever the LARP money comes in, that's just something that we're going to have to address and try to develop recommendations on as we know what's available. So that pretty much is it. I think that we just want to get some feedback on what City Council feels about their priorities, what roadways they feel need to be identified, if they fall in line with what we're showing on the plan, if the approach from a worst first strategy is something, and then obviously budget numbers. Carter was able to provide us with some more updated budget numbers for the future years, so hopefully we'll be able to get a better idea of those into the future.
Julie?
Just a quick question, and thank you, this is very helpful. In terms of the unit cost, when you were mentioning that the IMS was obviously higher than what it is currently, did these cost estimates take into account the lower cost, or is this using? Okay.
Those are the updated unit costs. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
And then I guess my second question, when you mentioned that you weren't able to access that IMS software, is that anything, Chris, that we're able to help them with? Is there a reason that we couldn't access the data, or you just didn't? We
could ultimately have access at a city computer. The city owns the software. I believe it's a pretty expensive suite for the software. We do not own the software that they used, so we had no direct access to it. I don't know what the protocol would have been for us coming in and accessing city computers and so on and so forth. That was said to be an option, but not one that ever came to total fruition.
So as a footnote, I would just ask our city manager, since one of the outcomes is that we need to reevaluate those costs, it would seem to me that that would be a pretty easy thing to resolve if we've got data that somehow couldn't be accessed by our consultants.
I think the other point is that Kimley Horn, we don't have a lot of experience, and when I say we don't have a lot, we don't have very much experience with that software. When we were if we were to have started this, we would have had to use a different program. So for us to really get started up on that with your, with the city time and funds, it just wasn't a best use of our time. I think it's something that IMS could easily update, or if the city finds it important to go ahead and learn how to use it. It wasn't in what we had planned to do.
It just says that we need to do something to resolve the fact that we've got some estimated costs that obviously now need to be adjusted.
Yeah. And anything in the recommended plans are all updated unit cost. The biggest thing, the two things that we lack by not being able to get into the software are this backlog number because every project changes. And what happens when these projects change, the program is obviously going to bump more projects up into the recommendations, and that's ultimately going to impact what the area weighted PCI value based on those decisions are. So that's the biggest thing. The numbers you're seeing there are the updated costs. And we've got all the data. It's just in spreadsheet form. So that's how we were able to come to what we were able to come to, but we're not able to get in and get everything out of it. And that's something else with these pavement management systems, and something that was lacking from the original system is, junk in is junk out. And if we get bad unit costs in, it's the type of system you push run, it's going to spit you a result. And it's either going to be right or it's going to be wrong. And we were kind of brought in by Public Works as an outside eye to help develop, because what they were given originally wasn't realistic in terms of the CIP. It would recommend one piece of a road in 1 year, and then 1,000 feet down the road, it would recommend that the next year that next piece be done. And from an engineering standpoint, it just wasn't a realistic number.
So am I led to believe then that the overlay portion of this is the LARP portion?
The LARP portion is more of the residential roadways that have been identified by the city. The LARP is not the...
None of those are LARP.
Right. None of these are LARP dollars.
Oh, they're not.
Your
So
LARP your LARP dollars are summarized in this. There's a spreadsheet in your packet. They're down at the bottom of the spreadsheet
They're also in the map. They're separate
as a different
green,
color. Yeah.
Okay, so these numbers here, these estimated costs, do not include
Do not
LARP
include
funds.
that. Yeah.
That's the total cost.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's something that we kind of wanted to point out, is that there was the LARP money, and then there was this big capital budget money, and that's what we're really trying to focus on now, is because we have no idea what the LARP's going to be. I mean, we just spoke with some of the public works guys, and I mean, who knows if there's going to be any this year? No one knows. So we wanted to keep that money separate, and that doesn't come out of your pocket except for what the pre-overlay repairs are, which is important because there are going to need to be that. What that dollar amount is, we don't know, because we don't know how much we're going to have in LARP. So that's a bit of an unknown.
So with Morris Road, with the reconstruction, the patch, and the overlay, how confident are you of that estimate?
I mean, we're fairly confident of it. We think it's going to be close. I think what we assumed was reconstruction of 30% of the roadway, full depth reconstruction of 30%, and then isolated areas of patching for distressed areas, and then an overlay on top of it is what the recommendation was going to be.
So would that...
So it wasn't a complete reconstruction of the entire length of Morris Road.
So what process had you anticipated there, kind of a total depth reclamation
Yeah, just
process?
in the 30% would be a full depth complete reconstruction. Yeah, and I think there's an area which mainly would be concentrated down where the road dips down and gets down towards the bottom is the area that we had really identified for the full depth reconstruction.
So this doesn't take into account any drainage repairs?
No, this is just strictly pavement-related project cost.
Did you observe any issues out there with any drainage issues that were contributing, say, to some of this deterioration of these roads?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to tell with what we were doing in our scope outlined, just a visual, quick windshield survey to verify the distresses.
I understand that term.
And we spent quite a bit of time with the public works people and they obviously showed us some areas where they felt there were drainage issues and such. So that doesn't really take into account those things, but it was considered.
Maybe I could ask Carter if talking about, talking about some drainage issues contributing to some of the deterioration of these pavements. Have we done any assessments of those possible areas out there that are,
On Morris Road itself?
well, in
Or
particular?
or on all of them?
Well, in Morris Road in particular.
I don't know specifically about Morris Road, and we'll look into that. I think anytime we've done these capital improvements before, drainage was one of the things that we have looked at. How much it's been included in Morris Road, I don't know that right now. Sorry.
I know when we drove Morris Road back in March, there was some concern about drainage, especially because apparently the median is always irrigated and kind of
Puddles.
sprays the asphalt daily. So that is something that we could consider, or you could look into. Is you don't necessarily want to wet your roads every day.
For several reasons.
But we did talk about that, and you're wasting your nice clean water. But
I have a couple of questions. Number one, the budget that you worked off of, you said was about, you thought we had about 2 point.
Well, what we were originally told was $2 million.
Let me interject real quick,
Where did
because
you get that from?
yeah, let me just interject real quick as I'm working through this with Carter. It's almost
The reason
funny.
for my question is the reason for your pause, because
Yeah,
you're wasting time.
we
and
are.
money.
We are. We're absolutely wasting folks' time tonight. And if we could get a couple of minutes to regroup, I think we need to provide some better information to you than what's being presented.
Let me ask another question then. Thompson Road has been paved north of Cogburn-Hopewell Road just recently, within the last couple of months. So is this the opposite end of Thompson Road?
Yes.
Shows you on the map.
In the spreadsheet or on the map, it
Or
will
it
show
just
you.
said Thompson, South Thompson Road.
Look at the map.
hopefully that clarifies.
So this is in addition to what's already been done?
Yes. That's
And I guess it'd be helpful to know maybe an inventory of what we have done already to date, since we've been a city, to kind of.
I think we have some of that information. We could get it from Public Works, and we could also show it, like say what's been done in the last 3
I
years.
mean, I know Thompson because we drive up and down, and it's pretty obvious. Looks pretty good. And then, you said that Kensington Farms was committed. What does that mean?
We were just advised that road was, half of that road was committed to be repaid.
I mean, is that something that we committed because they've done something for us, or because we're
Committed.
What does committed mean?
About what?
It wasn't a priority, but it's been
Maybe
committed
left out of
as.
park or something.
But it's PCI's at 10, so I mean, it needs to be, it ultimately needs to be addressed. And Angela's trying to find some notes, but
I don't recall. I just remember it had been expressed to us that this was a commitment that the city had made to residents. I don't remember, a school or something, and then
Okay.
it was in poor condition, and maybe it didn't receive LARP fundings. But we were just told that, and we wouldn't have left it up there if the PCI was 74. But because it really has real substance and need, we can.
So, and you guys are working with Dan Drake to facilitate?
Yes.
this? All right, then,
Christie,
Mayor,
go ahead.
yeah, we're as I said before, we're wasting everybody's time at this point with this presentation. We just need to stop it and provide you correct information. So I just ask that we defer this until a later date. It's not prepared for presentation.
what does that mean?
Well, that means that I'm looking at this report that shows, I'll tell you exactly what it means. I'm looking at this report that shows that these items are programmed in fiscal year 10, and those are items that are funded in fiscal year 9 and are ready for construction now. So if we're going to sit here and look at a capital budget, I want to make sure we're looking at an accurate capital budget, and what I'm seeing in this presentation doesn't match our budget that's adopted by the city.
Okay.
Right. Thank you. The city clerk, please sound the next item.
Mr. Mayor, we added an executive session to discuss personnel.
I have a motion and a second to adjourn into executive session to discuss personnel.
So moved. Second.
I have a motion by Councilmember Thurman, second by Councilmember Diaversa.
All those in favor of the motion, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? It's unanimous, 7:09.
We're looking at Morris Road and Hickory Flat Road.
We're going into executive session.
Yeah.
I just think to prepare the meeting.
So what you're saying, it's a lot less to do the gravel. Yeah. Although you have to do it more often.
Maybe explain it to us.
Well, maybe
I just
not.
need to at least explain it to the folks that
Yeah.
are obviously here, because we've got executive session, and I think it's going to appear rude, from my perspective, if we just walk out and you're left not knowing.
What's going on?
I just didn't want you guys saying it.
Yeah, do it, run that out.
Oh, by the way, we found posts.
We had some. So that'll save us some money on it.
Julie.
Yes, sir. Yeah, I'm going.
they go into executive section? Okay. How long ago was that? Oh, really? Okay, thanks.
And I'm not so much concerned, I would like for you to understand sort of where things might have
I think that helps make it more productive.
Oh, I want to talk to you.
Okay, you guys pull together
Yeah.
just the information for me so I can bring up your hard copy tomorrow. That's what I'd like to do. No,
Oh, I would love to stay for the meeting
no.
tomorrow.
I'm gonna talk to him and then we'll all talk outside. Just give me a minute, okay?
I move, go ahead. I'll second Bill's motion to reconvene.
I have a motion by Councilmember Lutz, second by Councilmember Thurman. All in favor? Aye.
That's it, 'cause we don't return to work session.
I make a motion, oh, we don't have to adjourn, so we're.
It's a meeting, work
All right,
session
let
adjourned.
me,
Nope.
Linda's gone.